Welcome to another deep dive. I'm always fascinated by those moments when a new idea clicks and you're like, aha, that's how it works. But as someone who enjoys thinking deeply about things, I often find myself wondering about the whole process that leads to those breakthroughs. I mean, what exactly is scientific discovery anyway?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And it turns out it's not such a simple question to answer because discovery isn't just about those sudden light bulb moments. It's often this much more complex and extended journey. And that's something that's really clear when you look at what philosophers have had to say about it.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how philosophers have grappled with the question of where new scientific ideas come from and what makes them, well, legitimately scientific.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're going to be drawing primarily on excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on scientific discovery.
And as you might imagine, it's a pretty in-depth and rigorous piece. But I think that'll be perfect for our discussion because we want to get into the nitty-gritty of this.
Definitely. So to start, we could go all the way back to how people thought about discovery before the 19th century.
Mm.
Back then, discovery had a much broader meaning than it often does today. It could refer to pretty much any new finding, whether it was a new star in the sky, or a new species of plant, or even a novel way to solve a mathematical equation.
Right. It makes sense. It's like if you stumble upon something new, you've discovered it. But it's interesting that you mentioned math and philosophy alongside those other examples because it seems like even the methods themselves for approaching those fields were often viewed as tools for making new discoveries.
Absolutely. Think about the ancient Greeks, for instance. Their emphasis on logical analysis and deduction wasn't just about explaining what was already known, but about actively uncovering new truths.
It was like a process for literally thinking your way to new knowledge.
Yeah, and then as we move into the early modern period, thinkers like Avicenna, Zabarella, and even someone like Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, or Isaac Newton, they all started developing more specific guidelines for how to acquire new knowledge.
It's like they were trying to turn discovery into like a more systematized art. And with Bacon, you really see this emphasis on systematic investigation, right? Like
Yeah.
his whole thing about identifying those underlying form natures of things.
Right. His idea was that there were these fundamental properties of things, these form natures, that could be uncovered through this very structured process of investigation.
It almost sounds like an early version of the scientific method. I mean, all those tables he created for comparing instances where something is present versus absent, it's like a precursor to controlled experiments.
Totally. He believed in this kind of deliberate, organized approach to understanding the natural world, this art of discovery.
Hmm.
And what's cool is that in his Silverum, he actually gave all these practical examples, almost like case studies, of how to carry out this kind of systematic inquiry.
So it was more than just theory. He was trying to show how it could be applied.
Exactly. Now, as we move into the 18th and early 19th centuries, philosophers started to shift their focus a bit. They began looking more closely at existing scientific practices and trying to build models of what constituted sound scientific reasoning.
It's like they were taking those earlier ideas about methodology and trying to refine them, make them even more rigorous.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that in the 20th century, looking back at those earlier thinkers, there was this distinction that was made between what became known as generative and consequentialist theories of method. The idea was that the earlier thinkers, they were all about finding the right method, the right set of rules, and that simply following those rules would guarantee you new, reliable knowledge.
So it's like following a recipe for scientific truth. Just do steps A, B, and C, and voila, you have a new discovery.
Right, but then this later consequentialist view emerged, which argued that the validity of a scientific idea wasn't so much about how you came up with it, but about its consequences. In other words, did it hold up to empirical testing? Could you make accurate predictions based on it?
So the focus shifted from the process of discovery to the validation of its results.
Yeah, but our source points out that this historical division, generative versus consequentialist, is maybe a little bit too neat and tidy. The reality was probably more nuanced. There were definitely elements of consequentialist thinking present earlier on, and those early generative approaches weren't always about finding absolute certainty. It was more about establishing what they called moral certainty, a high degree of confidence based on careful systematic inquiry.
So it wasn't like they thought they had a foolproof recipe for truth, but they were still aiming for something more reliable than just random guesswork.
Right. And speaking of the steps involved in discovery, a really important development happens around the 18th and 19th centuries. This is when the process of discovery starts to get broken down into distinct components: observation, that spark of insight, the articulation of an idea, its further development, and finally, testing.
So it's no longer seen as this single monolithic thing, but rather as a sequence of stages. And this raises the question, are there rules or guidelines for each of these stages?
Exactly. And William Whewell, a philosopher writing in the 19th century, becomes a key figure in this shift. He really delved into the nuances of this breakdown in his work, Philosophy of the Inductive Sciences. He's known for making a clear distinction between the initial happy thought, that moment of insight, and what happens after.
I like that phrase, happy thought. It captures that feeling when a new idea suddenly clicks into place. But was he saying that those happy thoughts are just random occurrences, or did he think there was something more to them?
He actually had a very interesting take on it. He said discovery consists of three main parts. First, you have the happy thought, that initial inspiration, which he didn't think could be reduced to a set of rules. You couldn't just follow a formula and have a happy thought.
So there's an element of intuition or creativity involved.
Definitely. But he also emphasized that having that happy thought often required a mind that was already well prepared, a mind that was steeped in the relevant knowledge and ready to make those crucial connections.
It's like the soil needs to be fertile for the seed of that new idea to take root.
Exactly. But then he goes on to say you have the second part, which he called colligation. This is where you take that initial insight and you start to bring together all these seemingly disparate facts and observations under its umbrella. And in the process, both the facts and the idea itself get refined and clarified. It's very iterative.
It's like a dance between the idea and the evidence, where they both shape each other.
Exactly. And then the final part is verification. This is where you put that newly formed idea to the test. Does it actually explain the phenomena adequately? Does it have predictive power? Is it simple and elegant? Does it exhibit what he called consilience?
I've heard that term consilience before. It has something to do with how well an idea fits together with other established knowledge, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like the ultimate test of a good scientific idea. Can it not only explain the things it was designed to explain, but also shed light on other seemingly unrelated areas?
So for Well, it wasn't just about having a bright idea. It was about all the steps that came after, the articulation, the development, the rigorous testing, all of that was essential to the process of discovery.
Right. He believed those later stages weren't just afterthoughts. They were actually amenable to analysis. You could develop guidelines and principles to help guide people through those stages.
And his ideas actually lay the groundwork for a huge debate that shaped 20th century philosophy of science. The distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification.
This distinction ended up being massively influential. It drew this really sharp line between two aspects of science: how new ideas come about, the context of discovery, and how you defend those ideas and prove they're valid, the context of justification.
So it's like separating the creative process from the validation process.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to separate that messy, often unpredictable process of coming up with a new idea from the more rigorous process of determining whether it was actually true.
And the argument was that discovery, that initial spark of insight, was fundamentally non-rational. It was all about intuition, psychology, maybe even chance.
Right. And because of that, they said it was outside the scope of philosophy of science, which was supposed to be all about establishing the rules and standards for justifying scientific claims, for determining what makes them knowledge.
So philosophy was in charge of setting the rules of the game, but not with how the players came up with their moves.
Exactly. And this perspective led to what's known as the discovery machine objection. Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, was a big proponent of this. He argued that there couldn't be a logical method, like an algorithm, for just churning out new scientific ideas. The only part of science that was really susceptible to logical analysis was the process of testing a fully formed idea. He even famously said that the initial stage, the act of conceiving or inventing a theory, seemed to me neither to call for logical analysis nor to be susceptible of it.
So for Popper, coming up with a new idea was more in the realm of psychology or maybe even art than it was in the realm of logic.
Exactly. And even if you tried to argue that discovery wasn't just this instantaneous flash of insight, that it was a more extended process with some kind of reasoning involved, you ran into what was called the metaphilosophical objection.
That sounds pretty serious. What was that all about?
Well, the argument was that analyzing how scientists articulate and develop their ideas, that wasn't really philosophy. That was more in the domain of psychology or sociology, because it was about studying how scientists actually behave in practice.
So it was about describing what scientists do rather than prescribing what they should do.
Right. And then you have the perspective from sociology of science, which goes even further and says that discovery is actually this kind of retrospective label that we apply to things. It's a social construct that's based on agreement and negotiation within the scientific community.
So it's not so much about a single moment of insight, but about a whole social process of recognizing and accepting certain ideas as significant. It's about who gets credit for discoveries and how those stories are told.
Exactly. So you can see how all these different objections really put the philosophy of scientific discovery in a tough spot for a while. It was almost like it was considered off limits for serious philosophical investigation.
It had been relegated to the sidelines.
Yeah, but as the 20th century went on, this strict separation between discovery and justification started to face more and more pushback. People began to realize that understanding how discoveries happen is actually really important for understanding science as a whole. You can't just ignore it.
So it's back in the game. And what were some of the main arguments for bringing it back?
Well, one of the big shifts was a movement towards integrating empirical research into philosophical analyses of discovery. So philosophers started looking at what cognitive science, psychology, and sociology could tell us about how scientists actually make discoveries.
It's like they realized that they needed to look beyond just logic and abstract principles and actually study the messy reality of scientific practice.
Exactly. And this led to a growing consensus that discovery isn't just this mystical, inexplicable event. It's a process that we can analyze, that we can understand, even if it doesn't follow strict logical rules.
So even if we can't program a discovery machine, that doesn't mean we can't say anything interesting or useful about how discoveries happen.
Exactly. And this led to a renewed interest in developing what you might call a logic of discovery.
I thought we couldn't have a logic of discovery. Isn't that what Popper said?
Well, yeah, in the strict sense of formal logic, maybe not. But when people talk about a logic of discovery now, they're often using the term more broadly. They're talking about the patterns of reasoning that are involved, the strategies and heuristics that scientists use to come up with new ideas.
So it's more about identifying the kinds of moves that are likely to lead to new discoveries, even if those moves aren't always guaranteed to work.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts that came out of this renewed focus on discovery is the idea of abduction.
Abduction? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, it's a term that was popularized by a philosopher named Norwood Hanson. He argued that coming up with a new hypothesis isn't just about induction, where you generalize from observations, or deduction, where you derive conclusions from premises. It's about this different kind of reasoning, this abduction, which is also known as retroductive inference. It's this idea that you start with a surprising observation, and then you reason backwards to a possible explanation.
So it's like you see something unexpected and you try to figure out what could have caused it.
Exactly. Think of it like a detective at a crime scene. They see all these clues that don't quite make sense, and they have to come up with a hypothesis that would explain them.
So it's not about proving something beyond a shadow of a doubt, but about finding the most plausible explanation for something that's puzzling you.
Exactly. Hansen actually laid out this kind of schematic for abduction. He said you start with a surprising phenomenon, and then you reason that if a particular hypothesis were true, that phenomenon would no longer be surprising. So you kind of reason backwards from the surprising observation to a potential explanation.
And this makes sense. It's like if you're a doctor and you see a patient with a bunch of weird symptoms, you try to think of a disease that would explain all those symptoms.
Right. And Hansen used Kepler's discovery of elliptical orbits as a famous example of abduction in science.
So Kepler observed that the planets weren't moving in perfect circles, as everyone had assumed, and he had to come up with a new explanation for why they were moving in these strange elliptical paths.
Exactly. But our source does point out that Hansen's interpretation of Kepler's discovery has been challenged by some historians of science.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, it turns out that the historical details of Kepler's discovery are actually pretty complex, and some historians argue that it wasn't a straightforward case of abduction, as Hansen described it.
So it's a good reminder that the history of science is often messier than we might think.
Right. But even if the Kepler example isn't perfect, the general idea of abduction as a key part of scientific discovery is still pretty influential. Although it's worth noting that not everyone agrees that abduction is a strictly logical process.
Why not? I mean, it seems like a pretty reasonable way to come up with hypotheses.
Well, one issue is that you can often come up with multiple hypotheses that could explain the same surprising observation. So it's not like there's always a single, logically inevitable answer.
That's true. And how do you choose between those competing hypotheses?
That's where things get tricky. And then there's also the issue that abduction, as it's often described, seems to focus more on evaluating existing potential explanations rather than explaining how those explanations actually come to mind in the first place.
Right. It's like it assumes you already have a set of possible hypotheses to choose from, but where do those hypotheses come from?
That's the million-dollar question. But even with those criticisms, the concept of abduction has continued to evolve. There are now distinctions being made between what's called selective abduction, where you choose the best explanation from a set of known possibilities, and creative abduction, where you actually come up with a brand new hypothesis that no one has thought of before.
So selective abduction is like multiple choice, while creative abduction is like coming up with your own answer from scratch.
Exactly. And there's also been a push to broaden the concept of abduction beyond just purely verbal, logical reasoning. Some philosophers are now arguing that abduction can involve nonverbal mental representations, like visual imagery, auditory impressions, even motor experiences.
So it's not just about thinking things through in words, but also about using different kinds of mental representations to explore possible explanations.
Right. Paul Thagard, for instance, has proposed this really interesting neural account of abduction, where he tries to ground it in the actual workings of the brain.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
So his idea is that mental representations are essentially patterns of activity in populations of neurons in the brain. And abduction, in his view, is a kind of combination or convolution of these neural activity patterns.
So it's like your brain is taking these different pieces of information, these different mental representations, and kind of mashing them together in new and creative ways to come up with new explanations.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really interesting approach to understanding discovery, one that comes from the field of artificial intelligence. Heuristic programming.
Heuristic programming.
Yeah, so the pioneers of this approach, people like Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, they were basically trying to model scientific discovery using computational tools.
So instead of just observing scientists and trying to figure out what they're doing, they were actually trying to program computers to make discoveries.
Right, and their idea was that you could view scientific discovery as a form of problem solving. And you could represent this problem-solving process within a structured framework called a problem space.
And what exactly is a problem space?
Well, it's basically a way of representing all the possible states of a problem, including the initial state, the goal state, and all the possible actions or operators that you can use to move from one state to another.
So it's like a map of all the possible paths you could take to solve a problem.
Exactly. And then you have these things called heuristics, which are basically rules of thumb for navigating that problem space efficiently. They help you narrow down the possibilities and focus your search for a solution, even if they don't guarantee that you'll find one.
So they're like shortcuts or strategies that can help you find a solution more quickly.
Right. And what's really interesting is that they actually developed computer programs like Bacon and Kikata that could use these heuristics to rediscover historical scientific laws and cycles.
So they were able to program computers to make discoveries that humans had already made.
Yeah, exactly. For example, one of the programs was able to rediscover Kepler's third law of planetary motion, which describes the relationship between the orbital period of a planet and its distance from the sun.
That's pretty impressive. But I guess it makes sense if you think about it. I mean, if there are patterns in the data, then a computer should, in principle, be able to detect those patterns.
Right. And the idea was that by developing these programs, they could start to understand the underlying logic of discovery, the kinds of reasoning processes that scientists use, even if those processes aren't always perfectly logical or algorithmic.
So it's like they were trying to reverse engineer the process of discovery by seeing if they could get computers to do it. But were there any limitations to this approach?
Yeah, definitely. One issue is that real-world scientific problems often involve what are called ill-defined problem spaces, where the initial state and the goal state aren't clearly specified.
So it's like you don't always know where you're starting or where you're trying to go.
Exactly. And another issue is that these early programs typically relied on being given the relevant data in advance. They couldn't necessarily figure out on their own what data was important to collect or what experiments to run.
So they were good at finding patterns in data that was already given to them, but they weren't so good at figuring out what data to look at in the first place.
Right. But with the more recent advancements in machine learning, especially deep learning, there's been a resurgence of interest in the possibility of machine discovery. And a lot of people are now working on developing AI systems that can actively collect data and design experiments.
So maybe one day we'll have AI scientists that can make genuinely new discoveries on their own.
Maybe so. But we'll come back to the topic of machine discovery later on. For now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another really influential perspective on scientific discovery, one that's associated with the philosopher Thomas Kuhn.
I've heard of Kuhn. He's the guy who came up with the idea of paradigm shifts, right?
Exactly. And his view of scientific discovery is really intertwined with his broader theory of paradigms and scientific revolutions. He argued that discovery isn't just a single event, it's an extended process that's closely tied to changes in these overarching paradigms.
So remind me again, what exactly is a paradigm?
A paradigm is basically a shared set of fundamental assumptions, values, theoretical concepts, and exemplary problem solutions that guide scientific research within a particular field. It's kind of like the lens through which scientists view the world.
So it's not just about the specific theories, but also about the underlying assumptions and the ways of thinking that are shared by a community of scientists.
Right, and Kuhn argued that most of the time, science operates within what he called normal science, where scientists are basically working within the dominant paradigm, trying to solve puzzles and refine existing theories.
So they're not really trying to make radical new discoveries, but rather to make the existing paradigm more complete and more accurate.
Exactly. And Kuhn argued that genuine discovery, the kind that leads to those big paradigm shifts, often happens when scientists start to encounter anomalies.
Anomalies?
Yeah, anomalies are basically phenomena that the current paradigm can't adequately explain. They're things that don't fit the expected pattern, that challenge the existing theories.
So it's like when you're working on a jigsaw puzzle and you find a piece that doesn't seem to fit anywhere.
Exactly. And Kuhn argued that the more precise and well-articulated a paradigm is, the easier it is to recognize these anomalies. As he famously said, discovery commences with the awareness of anomaly, i.e., with the recognition that nature has somehow violated the paradigm-induced expectations that govern normal science.
So it's like, if you know exactly what you're expecting to see, then you're more likely to notice when something unexpected happens.
Right. And he used the historical discovery of oxygen as a great example of this. He pointed out that it wasn't a single clear-cut moment of discovery, but rather a long and drawn-out process involving multiple scientists who were struggling to make sense of these strange new phenomena that they were observing.
So it wasn't just about isolating a new element. It was about figuring out what it meant, how it fit into the existing theories of matter and combustion.
Exactly. And Kuhn's point was that the discovery of oxygen wasn't just about a new substance. It was about a whole new way of understanding the world. It led to a major paradigm shift in chemistry.
It's a good reminder that discoveries are often embedded in these larger conceptual frameworks, and that the process of discovery can involve a lot of back and forth, a lot of refining and revising of both the data and the theories.
Right. And Kuhn also pointed out that discovering an anomaly isn't always easy. It's not just about seeing something new. It's about understanding that what you're seeing is actually significant, that it challenges the existing paradigm. As he put it, novelty emerges only with difficulty, manifested by resistance, against a background provided by expectation.
So it's not just about observing something new. It's about recognizing that it's actually important, that it requires a change in how we think about the world.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that there's now some evidence from cognitive neuroscience that supports this idea. It seems like our brains are actually wired to resist conceptual change, even when we're faced with evidence that contradicts our existing beliefs.
So we have to kind of overcome our own cognitive biases in order to make those truly groundbreaking discoveries.
Right. And this brings us to a whole other approach to understanding discovery, which is sometimes called methodologies of discovery.
Methodologies of discovery, what's that all about?
Well, these are approaches that don't necessarily try to come up with the strict logic of discovery in the algorithmic sense, but they do view discovery as an extended process of generating and articulating new ideas, often framed as a form of problem solving.
So it's not just about having a flash of insight, it's about all the steps that you take to develop and refine that insight into a full-fledged theory or explanation.
Exactly. And what's interesting about these methodologies is that they start to blur the line between discovery and justification, because the methods that you use to come up with an idea can actually provide initial reasons to believe that the idea might be on the right track.
So it's like the process of discovery itself can offer some evidence in support of the discovery.
Right. And our source mentions this idea of a three-part framework for understanding discovery. You have the initial context of discovery proper, which is that moment of insight, that happy thought. But then you have a context of pursuit, where you start to articulate and develop that idea, and finally a context of justification, where you put it to the test through rigorous empirical investigation.
So it's like a three-stage process coming up with the idea, fleshing it out, and then testing it.
Exactly. And within these methodologies of discovery, you have concepts like discoverability or generative justification.
What are those?
So discoverability or generative justification is this idea that the methodology of discovery itself can be a form of justification, a way of providing evidence in support of a claim, even before it's been rigorously tested. It's a way of showing that a particular discovery was, in principle, achievable, given the existing knowledge and the methods that were available.
So it's like saying that even if we don't have definitive proof yet, the way that we arrived at this idea gives us some reason to believe that it might be true.
Right. And then you have approaches that focus on what's called preliminary appraisal or weak evaluation. These are methods that involve doing some initial evaluation of an idea before it's subjected to full-blown empirical testing.
So it's like a kind of pre-screening process where you try to weed out the really bad ideas before you invest a lot of time and resources in testing them.
Exactly. And the philosophical task here is to figure out what rules or criteria scientists use to do this initial evaluation. What are the constraints that guide their thinking at this early stage?
And I'm guessing these strategies are probably going to be different depending on the specific scientific field that you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. For example, in the philosophy of biology, there's been a lot of work done on the methodology of discovering biological mechanisms.
Like the mechanisms of how cells work or how genes are expressed.
Exactly. And one of the ideas that has come out of this work is the notion of schema instantiation. It's this idea that scientists often use abstract schematic representations of mechanisms, and then they fill in the specific details and modify those schemas as they learn more about a particular biological process.
So it's like they have a kind of template or blueprint for a mechanism, and then they adapt that template to fit the specific case that they're studying.
Right. And this process of schema instantiation can actually be quite creative and can lead to genuinely new discoveries about how biological systems work.
And these aren't just random guesses or speculations, right? They're based on existing knowledge and on proven methods that have worked in the past.
Exactly. They have what's called a weak normativity, meaning that they're not guaranteed to work, but they've been successful enough in the past that they're worth trying.
So it's like they're good rules of thumb, even if they're not ironclad laws.
Right. And finally, within these methodologies of discovery, there's been a resurgence of interest in what are called heuristic strategies. These are basically rules of thumb for problem solving that are neither purely subjective nor strictly algorithmic.
So they're somewhere in between just going with your gut and following a rigid set of rules.
Exactly. And the emphasis here is on finding good reasons to pursue certain lines of inquiry or to employ particular strategies, even if those strategies don't guarantee a successful outcome.
So it's about making informed decisions about how to approach a problem, even when you don't have all the information.
Right. And this approach draws a lot on insights from fields like cognitive psychology, management science, and other fields that study how people make decisions under conditions of uncertainty.
So it's not just about philosophy anymore. It's about integrating insights from other disciplines to understand how scientists actually think and work.
Exactly. And one of the key ideas here is that scientists aren't just puzzle solvers in the sense that Kuhn described them. They're also problem solvers in a much broader sense. They have to deal with complex, ill-defined problems where the goals and the rules aren't always clear.
So they have to be adaptable and creative, and they have to be able to think on their feet.
Right. And there's been a lot of work done on identifying the specific heuristics that scientists use in different fields. For example, there's Gerd Gigerenzer's tools to theory heuristic, which suggests that scientists often use simple practical heuristics to develop complex theories. And there's even work being done on developing formal methods for assessing the effectiveness of different heuristics.
So it's like they're trying to quantify the effectiveness of different problem-solving strategies.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really exciting area of research that's been getting a lot of attention lately. The cognitive perspective on discovery.
The cognitive perspective.
Yeah, so this is a relatively new approach that focuses on the actual cognitive processes that are involved in making discoveries. It draws on insights from philosophy of mind, cognitive science, psychology, and even neuroscience.
So it's really taking a multidisciplinary approach to understanding how scientists think.
Exactly. And one of the big shifts that this approach has brought about is a renewed focus on the initial generation of novel hypotheses. It's no longer seen as this completely mysterious, inexplicable leap of intuition.
So they're trying to understand the cognitive mechanisms that underlie those aha moments.
Exactly. And there's been a lot of work done on defining and characterizing creativity itself in a scientific context.
So what exactly makes a scientific idea creative?
Well, the general consensus is that it needs to be both novel or original and also significant or valuable in some way. And there are also distinctions being made between different levels of novelty. For example, there's P creativity, which refers to something that's new for the individual, and then there's H creativity, which refers to something that's radically new for all of human history.
So P creativity is like coming up with a new recipe for your family, while H creativity is like inventing the wheel.
Exactly. And while earlier psychological studies focused on identifying personality traits that are often associated with creative scientists, more recent work has been looking at the actual cognitive and neural mechanisms that might be involved.
So they're trying to understand how the brain actually generates creative ideas.
Right. And there's a lot of debate about what those mechanisms might be. But one of the key ideas that has emerged is the importance of analogy.
Analogy.
Yeah. Analogy is basically the process of applying understanding from one domain or system to a new one. And it seems like analogy plays a really important role in scientific discovery because it allows scientists to take what they know about one thing and use it to understand something else that's new and unfamiliar.
So it's like using a metaphor to understand something that's hard to grasp directly.
Exactly. And there's a lot of really interesting work being done on the cognitive science of analogy, looking at how people actually map one domain onto another and what factors influence the success of that mapping process.
So they're trying to understand the mental processes that underlie our ability to use analogies effectively.
Right. And the work of Mary Hess has been really influential in this area. She emphasized the importance of not just the similarities between the source domain and the target domain, but also the differences and the areas of uncertainty.
So it's not just about finding things that are alike, it's also about understanding how they're different and where there are gaps in our knowledge.
Exactly. And she also made this important distinction between horizontal analogies and vertical analogies.
What's the difference between those?
So a horizontal analogy is based on similarities in properties. For example, you might say that the heart is like a pump because they both move fluids around. But a vertical analogy is based on similarities in the relationships between properties. So, for example, you might say that the relationship between the heart and the circulatory system is analogous to the relationship between the brain and the nervous system because they're both central control systems that regulate the activity of other organs.
So a vertical analogy is more about the underlying structure or organization of a system rather than just the surface level similarities.
Exactly. And Hesse argued that vertical analogies are particularly important for developing new scientific theories because they allow us to see deep structural similarities between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Host speaker.